Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon. I'm normally the moderator for these events, but I'm giving that auspicious position to somebody else today, which we'll get into in just a second. But before we do, I have a couple housekeeping items I do want to go over with you. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of today's event, just know that you'll receive a link via email post-event, which you can use to log on to the webinar on demand. You'll also be receiving, the link will also be available on the DevOps.com website. And we will be taking questions throughout today's webinar. So if at any time you have a question for our speaker, please just use the control panel, submit your questions, and we'll take a few minutes before the end of today's event to go through the audience questions. Okay, so the voices you will be hearing on today's webinar, which is Measure Twice, Alert Once or Less, How Priceline Leverages Catchpoint. The first voice will be Craig Lowell, who will be the moderator for today's event, filling my shoes. And the speaker today will be Tom Gerhard, who's a technology fellow for logging and monitoring at Priceline.com. Thank you both for joining me, gentlemen, and Craig, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Charlene, and good afternoon, or as Charlene said, good morning, wherever, depending on where you are. And welcome to this Catchpoint customer webinar. My name is Craig Lowell, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Our presentation today is done in partnership with Priceline.com and DevOps.com, and we'll focus on how Priceline has elevated their end-user experience monitoring beyond just traditional tests and alerts. Your presenter today will be Tom Gerhard, who serves as a technology fellow at Priceline.com, currently focusing on logging and monitoring. Today, he's going to be talking about 5 non-traditional use cases for Catchpoint and how these practices have helped Priceline discover unexpected performance issues, drive changes in their architecture, and hold their vendors accountable. As a reminder, Tom will remain online to answer all of your questions after the formal presentation. So if you do have one during the talk, just type it into the questions window on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Catchpoint yet, so before we hand it off to Tom, I'm going to take you through a really quick overview of who Catchpoint is and what we do. Catchpoint is a digital performance monitoring company that provides integrated synthetic and real user monitoring with real-time granular analytics all on a single platform. We have over 440 customers, including many of the leading global brands like Google, Honeywell, LinkedIn, and of course, Priceline. Catchpoint's platform was specifically designed by IT ops experts to provide complete visibility into the end user experience, with over 700 global vantage points for visibility across geographies, major ISPs and devices, or on-premise from your own locations. Our real-time analytics engine allows you to slice and dice dynamic, unaggregated data in any dimension for rapid, actionable insight. Catchpoint's comprehensive test types capture atomic-level data from your website, network, systems, apps, APIs, and real users to give you the broadest and deepest view of your online service performance. So now that you've got a bit more insight into how Catchpoint works, I'll hand things over to Tom.
Thanks, Craig. Like most Catchpoint customers, we use monitors, and especially the web monitors, to set alerts on performance metrics on key pages on our website. And we're using that to make sure that the thousands of customers that are experiencing our site at any given time are having the best possible experience, whether they're selecting a hotel, booking a rental car, or maybe a flight or a vacation package. And we've counted on Catchpoint as a key part of our toolkit to tell us when something's wrong for just about 8 years now. And during that time, we found some interesting ways to use Catchpoint above and beyond that normal setup alerts and wait for them to fire. So we're going to talk about some non-traditional uses of Catchpoint. The first one is first mile baseline tests. And we spend a lot of time tuning our alerts to make sure we're getting minimal false positives, making sure we capture shifts in trends and so forth. And yet one of the things that happens a lot is an alert will fire. And the first question is it us or is it the internet? Is there something going on between the Catchpoint agents and our site? And so our solution for that is to deploy what we call first mile nodes, one in each of our data centers. And if you're a Catchpoint user, you're probably familiar with last mile nodes, which are nodes that are on consumer and end user consumer devices, cable modems, and so forth. So a first mile node is the exact opposite. In this case, the node being hosted in our data center gives us the closest possible view of our website, the least variability from the internet. And so we run, for example, for our homepage, we run a test from a collection of backbone nodes, and we also run it from each of a handful of first mile nodes. And then when we have an alert, it's simple to see. Do the first mile nodes show an issue? If not, probably our site is okay. If they do, then there's a good chance it is related to our site, unless it's a third-party object. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. So here's just a real quick view of what it looks like. We position the private nodes in our network, or enterprise nodes, so that they actually go out to the internet and come back in through our load balancer like any normal customer traffic. So we're exposed to a little bit of internet variability, but a very small amount, because basically the two interfaces are one or two hops apart from each other. So this gives us minimal exposure to the internet and the closest view of what's happening on our site. So one of the things that makes that work best is that the tests, we run a different test on each data center's node, and we use overrides to force the traffic into the same data center. So if the test is running on a node in data center A, we want that traffic from that test to go to data center A's load balancer. And we use the request override feature in the test configuration to do that. In this case, I'm showing 4 different host names being overridden to IP addresses that are specific to that data center. And DNS override is one of my favorite Catchpoint features. And what it is doing, so for example, if we look at the 4th one, www.priceline.com, it's telling the Catchpoint agent, go ahead and look it up. Look this name up in DNS, but ignore it and use the value that I put in the value. And there are full IP addresses in that spot, and we've just whited out the first 3 octets. Here's an example of a chart showing the blue line is the aggregated value from the backbone nodes, and the red and green are from 2 first mile nodes. And as you'd expect, the first mile nodes show better performance than the backbone nodes because they're closer to the content. The variability is interesting. You can see that both are trending the same. In this particular case, they're both essentially flat. And typically, if we make changes to page architecture and so forth, we will see these trend up or down together. As you will see in any time when you run tests like this, there is variability from test run to test run and from hour to hour, and that's represented there. If we take that blue line and break it out into the dozen or so individual nodes, you see a lot more of that variability. And I've highlighted the blue line toward the bottom. That's one of the 2 nodes that we saw at the bottom of the prior chart. They're still in the same place, but that blue summary line that was riding higher is now spread out among all these different values. And you can see how aggregating data really does tend to smooth things out. So once you've set this up, you're happy and everything looks good, but what might not work out as you expect? So one thing would be if you've got third-party objects on your page, and I doubt that there are any interesting pages on the internet that don't have third-party objects nowadays. You may have social media widgets or ad tracking or whatever. And those aren't going to be controlled by your overrides because they're not going to your data center. So those will affect your tests in your first mile nodes, but typically they're, and hopefully they're a smaller part of the overall part of the experience that you're measuring. So one option would be to set up zones and use zone reporting. And here I'm showing an example of just setting up two zones, one called Priceline CDN that matches a regex over there on the right side, and one called Priceline.com. And then I can report on those two zones and exclude data from the third-party objects if I need to. Another thing that you need to be aware of is you are testing that outbound connection. If you remember on the diagram, the first mile node was going out to the internet and coming back in on a different interface, and you are implicitly testing that. And if your first mile node tests fail and your backbone tests don't fail, there's a good chance that would be the cause. So it's just something to be aware of. Another thing that might happen or to consider, maybe you don't have the luxury of deploying an enterprise node in your data center. And in that case, what I would do is look carefully at the Catchpoint node map and look for nodes that are close, either geographically, they're in the same city as your data center, or topologically. Look at the backbone provider relative to where your data center sits on the internet. So moving on to my second favorite feature, is using Catchpoint for what-if scenarios. So you might be thinking about making some infrastructure changes, maybe deploying new servers, maybe you're changing something at your cloud provider, or evaluating a CDN. Back to my favorite tool in Catchpoint, the request override. Here's an example of taking those same 4 domain names that make up a Priceline page or some Priceline pages and using the DNS overrides to send them to a CDN that's been configured to support that traffic. And then run those tests in parallel with the ones that go directly to your origin or whatever your normal configuration is, and chart the data on the same chart. Break it down with the second test breakdown second chart breakdown as test, and it allows you to compare any of the Catchpoint metrics between the two variants. You might want to think about also testing, especially if your CDN has geographic load balancing capabilities, about working with your CDN provider to make sure you understand what you're testing. And that may involve targeting your Catchpoint tests at different IP addresses or different aliases than the one your customers go to, so that you know for sure which part of your CDN's infrastructure you've reached. Another variation on request overrides would be blocking specific third-party content. Here I picked on Google Publisher, the gpt.js tag. And in this case, I'm telling Catchpoint, block this request. Just act like it never happened, and let's see what happens to the page. Is it faster? Is it slower? Maybe that request is actually, there's something else dependent on it, and the page is going to delay rendering until something times out. And so this is a good way. You can also use request delay and specify a number of milliseconds. So with modern page designs or web application designs, a lot of useful activity is now happening after the onload event and may get delayed by asynchronous activities that used to always only happen after the page was fully loaded. So this is important to understand what's happening with your third-party objects. How are they affecting your page traffic? You can also use this technique if you are concerned about your Catchpoint testing showing up in your analytics. You may have A/B test analytics or Google Analytics or another tool like that. And so you could block your analytics tag from firing with this same technique. So lots of good reasons to use block or request delay. Another example, back to the CDN for a moment, would be to pick up a specific object and say, what would it be like if this object were loaded from a different place? And in this case, we've said, let's take an object called /fonts/styles.css and replace that request with the same object name, but from, again, I used a CDN as an example, but it might be a different domain in your world. And here I've used the host request path and query macro that Catchpoint provides, and that takes from the original request the part after the host name. So we're substituting for whatever host name this request had, the CDN, DNS, alias, or IP address, and then using the stem. And I could have typed /font/style.css instead of the macro, but if you do a bunch of these, it's a lot easier to cut and paste the same macro reference every time, rather than making sure every copy is the way you want it to be. Back when domain sharding was in vogue, before HTTP2, we used this to good effect with the random list macro and evaluated how performance of our pages would behave by sharding requests across 2, 3, 4, and 5 domain names. And that gave us a good sense of how many we might want to deploy for a production sharding configuration. So lots of different ways to put those Catchpoint macros together to come up with interesting things. Like in any of these things where you're doing tests with overrides, you always want to follow up with other data once you've deployed, and especially if you have the opportunity to deploy in an A/B test configuration. Send some of your traffic to the new config, some to the old, and test in live traffic, especially if you're using RUM, so you can see how this affected real users. Synthetic tests are excellent for giving you a directional idea of what is happening to your customer traffic, or in these cases, what might happen to your customer traffic. But it's always nice to have RUM data to confirm the actual result. So you've now set up all of these tests to try out your different configurations, and suddenly you sit back and say, oh, hey, I'm consuming a bunch of Catchpoint budget with this. And a couple of things I would note there. First is typically tests like this, you're not going to run them day in and day out all year long. I run a test like this for a few days, maybe a week or two, depending on the configuration, until I have enough data points that I feel they're statistically valid. And typically, when you run a test like this, the first data points you look at are all over the place. It's like, gee, I don't know if this is showing what I wanted to see or not. And then after 100 runs, you start to see a pattern emerge. And after 200, it starts to stabilize. And by the time you get to a couple hundred runs, you can start to be confident. Of course, that number will vary depending on what you're testing. But these aren't tests that we're running 24/7, except for the first mile tests, which we do run full-time for t-tests. We don't run them, we don't do that on every test. The other thing is, if you want to capture data like screenshots because you want to see when an alert fires, what does the page look like? Maybe you have content that's very dynamic and you want to be able to refer to what did the page look like at 2 o'clock when that alert fired. What I would suggest there is run a parallel test, but at a lower frequency and on fewer nodes. Capture those screenshots or film strips there, and that way you can go to that test and use it as a reference point to see what those features were doing at the time you're interested. Number 4 is a pretty easy one. You might have internal or external customers, and you want to report on service levels. Your management wants to know, how much of last month was our website performing within the parameters that we expect. Or you may have a partner if you're involved in a white label scenario, or you provide services to other businesses. And so set up a test configured with that. You might want to define aptX thresholds or other ways to track whether you're within those service levels. And I think if you're clever, you'll also set alerts that fire before you reach those thresholds so that if things are heading in the wrong direction, you have a chance to act on them before they violate your SLI. So that's a pretty straightforward case, and this is kind of pretty close to the traditional catchpoint scenario. And then the last case is a little different in that here I'm advocating for taking a manual look at some of your test results and looking at them perhaps from different dimensions. And you know, everyone's familiar with the theory that if you put in a frog in a pot full of cold water and gradually heat it to the boil, that you can cook a frog. But if you throw a frog in a pot of boiling water, it'll jump right out. And you know, in performance, a lot of times problems creep up on us and we don't notice them. And especially if your primary alerts are based on trend shifts. If your trend is shifting at a very gradual rate, you may not notice that things are creeping away from you unless you go back and look at some longer term perspective and possibly also looking at some different metrics. And so, you know, what I'm recommending here is really to make sure you have some hard KPIs as opposed to trend-related ones. Set up alerts on those absolute values. And, you know, typically they would be high enough that they're not going to create alerting noise for you. But also periodically look back at long-term trends. And here's an example of a chart I happened to pull last week. And I looked at this metric, which isn't one that we ordinarily look at. This happens to be an insight metric on one of our pages. And lo and behold, over the course of about 6 months, it had essentially doubled from about 1/4 of a second to 1/2 of a second. Nobody actually understood that this was happening. As it turns out, this wasn't a critical problem because this increase was compensated for by other improvements in the particular test and the page that was being tested. So the net performance of the page had in fact improved during this period, but the fact that the owners of the page weren't aware that this particular metric was creeping up was an opportunity for them to go back and look and say, hey, can we reverse some of this trend? So that was my five points, but a little bit of free advice. One is, I mentioned Insight a couple of times. Learn and understand the Catchpoint Insight functionality. Insight is the opportunity for you to create custom metrics that depend on what is happening with your site. And we use Insight, for example, so that we can break tests down by individual servers that are behind a load balancer. We report response times at our load balancer in addition to the Catchpoint response metrics. So we can see how long what was the response time that the load balancer measured for this page. You can capture routing information from a CDN if it presents it in headers, which is pretty common. You can also, in a transaction test, you can use JavaScript that you can run as part of your transaction script to capture content from the page and turn it into an insight metric and chart that. And that's something we've been exploring lately, using JavaScript to capture information on response time of APIs that are being called client side. Capture those API response times and report them back as insight metrics. And that way we can chart that data on Catchpoint alongside all of the built-in Catchpoint metrics. Another thing is to make sure you look at the Catchpoint APIs and some of the integrations that they enable. They've got quite a few established, and there's documentation available on how to set most of these up. Some of our favorites, Slack. We use the webhook API to push alerts into Slack, and it's great to be able to see, in one place, a collection and a history of alerts without going to the Catchpoint portal. And a lot of people at our site use that for a quick at-a-glance view of have there been recent Catchpoint alerts. You can also push data into Splunk from Catchpoint, and Catchpoint provide a Splunk add-on that make that easy to do. And we use that in places where we want to overlay Catchpoint test data with internal metrics that we have available on Splunk. And my grand favorite, as one of the administrators of Catchpoint in our company, is single sign-on. We use Okta for single sign-on in our company, and by adding Catchpoint to our Okta configuration, I no longer have to worry about provisioning individual users for Catchpoint access on our account. We just add them to a group in our Active Directory that enables Catchpoint access, and the job is done. So just to wrap up, you put all these things together, traditional alerting, setting thresholds, you may be using RUM, using some of these other strategies of doing comparative and exploratory monitoring and testing. What I really want to point out is that what's really important is that you have a comprehensive view from as many different perspectives as possible of how your operation is running. You don't want to just monitor from a single synthetic location. You want to monitor from different backbones. You may want to mix backbone and last mile monitoring, although that's a whole different talk. The first mile, if you can do it, I certainly advise doing that, because that gives a very nice sanity check on what you see from backbone nodes. And all of these give you opportunities to see what may or may not be working well from different perspectives, and only when you kind of look at the whole picture do you really know the whole picture. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and if we have any questions, we can address those.
All right, thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, so we did have a number of questions posed during the talk, so let's dive into those. Before we do, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have additional questions, please type them into the questions window before we wrap up today. So the first question is about evaluating third parties. So do you have any specific techniques for using Catchpoint to evaluate potential vendors that you're bringing on?
It would depend a lot on what the vendor is. If it's a case where it may be a widget we're putting on a page, we may run a Catchpoint object test referencing that widget, or an HTML test with a snippet that references that widget, and run it from a few different geographies over some period of time to get a sense of how it behaves, so that we know that we're comfortable including this on our page. And of course, anytime you include third-party content, you always want to make sure that your integration with your page is defensive, in that that content should not be in critical path to your page's rendering unless you really need it to be. And that's where using the request block and request delay after you've deployed it is helpful. If you put a 1,000 millisecond delay on that, and it delays rendering of your page by 1,000 milliseconds, you may want to reevaluate your implementation to make sure that the page can go on without. Or because that tells you that if the request is blocked, if the third party, for example, is accepting requests but not responding to them, your page may block indefinitely. If you're evaluating something like a CDN, our typical thing is we look at geography where we expect the customers to be that would be using that CDN, and we find Catchpoint nodes in that geography and run tests with that CDN and with our baseline configuration and compare them. And those tests typically will run a little bit longer than we might for some others.
Okay, great. Now, we had a question about the first and last mile tests that you mentioned. So the question was specifically, is a first mile test like a smoke test? So the answer is no on that, but maybe you could elaborate a bit on the different types of nodes that you're using, the different types of Catchpoint nodes and what they do.
Sure. I think we've used them all at various times, and they all have a purpose. So let's kind of work our way out from the first mile. So the first mile node gives you the best sense of how your infrastructure is behaving. Is your site up? Is it responding to requests? And has the smallest amount of variability from internet backbone outages and so forth. So that gives you that perspective. Our bread and butter tests are run on backbone nodes. We've found that performance on backbone nodes is within the same order of magnitude of what we measure with RUM for our customer, for our real customers, and gives us a perspective from different parts of the world and from different backbones that hopefully things are healthy. And when they're not healthy, then you can look down and say, okay, we've got 2 nodes that are on this same backbone and they're both struggling, or we have 3 nodes that are all struggling, but they are all in the Pacific Northwest. And a lot of times you can't do anything about that, but it's worth knowing that the problem isn't yours. You might have a backbone vendor you can work with to resolve a problem if it's close to you. But so that's backbone nodes. Then last mile nodes, as I mentioned earlier, those are deployed on typically consumer internet connections. It might be a Verizon Fios or a Comcast or Time Warner cable connection or whatever. The last mile nodes, they really tell you what the experience is like for somebody on those type of devices. But by their nature, there's a lot more variability in the testing. So you will see, when we looked at those jagged lines on one of my first slides, and those were even on nodes that were, sitting in our data centers in some cases, and you see a pretty good variation from one run to the next. When you go to the last mile nodes, there's a lot more variability. If you're on a cable modem and, it happens to be, whatever, a lot of people are streaming, a sports event or something, that in that neighborhood, that cable modem may struggle for a little while. And so you see a lot more variability there, but it gives you a richer view. We don't use last mile for alerting tests for that reason, but we do use it, for example, when we're testing CDNs and that type of access. And then the other would be the wireless nodes, which we typically use for infrequently scheduled tests where we want a longer-term baseline of how something performs on a wireless node.
All right, that was great. So we have another question here. Do you have any visibility for partially available websites? So will the system send alerts if the website fails 50% on 50% of the requests or 30% of the requests? And how do you detect those issues?
Yeah, great question. I don't believe we have any alerts configured specifically for those scenarios, but you should be able to get pretty close. The alerting configuration is very rich, and I believe you can count request failures and alert on that. You can also alert on JavaScript failures and set thresholds there. And the other thing is that you can set thresholds on the number of nodes that are in alert, so that if you set them low enough, you'll see problems that are regional. If you set them higher, those tend to fade further back.
Okay, awesome. So now you mentioned using synthetic and RUM data. So how would you recommend using those 2 metrics or 2 tools in tandem?
So we like to use synthetic data for alerting. It's the most stable, and from run to run, we know what the environment is, we know what the configuration is, and we can also do measurements there that are a little harder to capture with RUM. We use RUM then as a confirmation, both of what's happening in the real world and also to capture things that may be a little further out. So with RUM, you're typically testing a broader spectrum of your pages. With synthetic, you're saying, okay, here are 5 or 10 or 2 or 50 pages that we're going to set up explicit tests for, and those are the only ones you're ever going to know about. With RUM, if you have the opportunity to put RUM on all of your pages by enabling it in a template, for example, you then have a view of every page view that your customers see and the opportunity to see different things. So they do complement each other, I think, very nicely.
All right, and how does Catchpoint help you in the development stage of a website?
Great question. So we'll often use instant tests. We do have a node deployed in our QA environment, so we can test against our development and QA labs before we've released code, and so we will use Catchpoint to get a quick bird's eye view, more often running instant tests and looking at waterfalls to make sure that something has behaved the way we have. We have also used Catchpoint to monitor our QA environment and to make sure that it's available when it should be, because so many people depend on it.
All right, we've got, looks like we have 2 more questions. So what different strategies do you use for monitoring mobile performance versus desktop?
Good question. So I mentioned a little bit of usage of the Catchpoint wireless nodes. We use those for perspective for mobile web pages. And so typically we'll monitor for availability on backbone nodes on mobile pages, but we'll use the wireless nodes either for a less frequently running test or even just instant test to get a perspective that, okay, if this is loading in 2.5 seconds on a backbone node, is it 3 or is it 5 or 10 on a wireless node? But otherwise, we treat key mobile pages the same way we do key desktop pages. And of course, with the world moving toward responsive, the difference between those pages is starting to erode. And that may also be an opportunity to use the viewport settings on your test configuration so that you can trigger different views of your responsive pages.
All right, excellent. Now, we got one last question here. It's a nice little wrap-up question. So, in your time at Priceline, what major changes in the IT landscape have had the biggest effect on your day-to-day job? And what changes do you see coming in the future as well that would do that?
Wow. So certainly in this space, that's almost, is that a softball you guys wrote? I would say, certainly one of the biggest things has been our move to Catchpoint. We've really embraced Catchpoint when we first started using it almost 8 years ago. And, by having these types of features to be able to go in and do, stuff above and beyond the set a test and wait for the alert. But, I would say one other thing that now goes back 5 or 6 years is the whole concept of RUM and giving us a different type of insight into what's happening performance-wise with our pages. But I'm not sure I should even admit how long I've been at Priceline. It's a little bit over 17 years, so, the entire industry has changed so much during that time. It's hard to pick summaries there.
What about the next phase? Like, what's the next the next change in the landscape or development of new technology that's gonna affect your job and people in your industry going forward?
I think that tools like Catchpoint are evolving very quickly and providing capabilities that we haven't thought of yet. So many of the things 10 years ago, we weren't monitoring our DNS providers. Now we monitor our DNS provider with Catchpoint, and we've helped them diagnose problems a few times. And so I think examples like that where where we're learning new things we can measure and capture, and the ability to look at much more history. When we first adopted Catchpoint, the retention periods were much shorter. Now we're up to, I believe, 5-year retention for individual test data. And, so I can see a lot more backward, which helps us predict a little bit more about what to worry about going forward.
All right, awesome. So thank you so much, Tom, for the time today. So that seems to be all the questions we've had. So once again, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Tom and, of course, all of you in the audience who took time out of your day to attend and pose questions during the talk. Looks like we're all set here. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Greg.